just one topic for this week's news roundup, because it is potentially the most consequential in terms of how the next decade is going to play out. I have said on this channel before that it feels like every day politicians and other leading actors in the United States sit down and puzzle out what would be the next step they could take that would bring their country closer to civil war, and then they all decide to take that step. This week, the Colorado Supreme Court did what a number of others had clearly opted not to do, which was to decide that there was an obvious and correct case to bump Donald Trump off the primary ballot. Because nothing calms a situation more than taking non-democratic means to remove one of the main political protagonists for a coming election. The Colorado court decided to invoke the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, barring someone who has held an office where they swore to uphold the Constitution, who then subsequently took part in an insurrection designed to overthrow that Constitution, from holding office. They said that it was clear to them that Trump had done exactly that with the January the 6th invasion of the Capitol building, and hence he was ineligible to be a candidate because of the 14th Amendment. Now, this, of course, is instantly appealed to the US Supreme Court. Firstly, it's been taken that the legal question was whether the 14th Amendment applied to the office of President of the United States. The original court threw out the case because it said although it agreed that Trump had embarked on insurrection, it did not believe that the 14th Amendment applied to the president. The state Supreme Court overturned that, saying, "Oh yes it does." All of which absolutely misses the basic fundamental point. At this moment, Trump has not been found guilty in a court of law of insurrection. So what you have is a bunch of unelected judges, in Colorado's case all selected by a Democratic governor, although they're not such straightforward political appointees as you get from the Supreme Court, but that doesn't matter because the optics are what they are. Unelected judges deciding that Trump carried out an attempted insurrection. Now, that may well be their opinion. Look, it might be your opinion. It might even be the correct opinion, although many are arguing the opposite. And that's the point. It's just an opinion. All of us are entitled to them. But where is the due process when a judge who has never heard a specific case can decide that even in the absence of the detailed evidence, even in the absence of the defendant being given a chance to defend themselves, you can just declare their guilt and bump them from the ballot? The answer, of course, is that that is not due process. At least, as one of the dissenting judges noted, not sufficient to be appropriate to the gravity of the question at hand. Some commentators who seem desperately to want to believe that this can hold argue that the 14th Amendment is so clear that the Supreme Court could only decide to uphold this decision. As far as I can tell, that is based on a careful reading of the text through a heavy filter of wishful thinking. The 14th Amendment doesn't define insurrection, for example. It was crafted to deal with the aftermath of the Civil War, where people have been fighting in armies against the US government. In that context, it was clear who it was applied to, therefore they didn't bother to make a fine definition. Now, would the drafters have intended it to cover what happened on January the 6th? Well, people disagree. What happened on January the 6th? You may think it's obvious. I would bet the obvious would conveniently line up with your prior beliefs on that one, which is a tell for it not being obvious at all. Would the drafters have expected some form of due process for how all of this would be put into practice? You would presume so. Would a bunch of judges deciding that they already know the answer, and that's grounds for interfering in the election in the most direct way, would that be a good representation of what the drafters had in mind? not based on the traditions of the role that the judiciary is supposed to take and not take in relation to the electoral process. And so if you want to fuel the outrage of one side, if you want to make them think that the system is being run by dark and anti-democratic forces, that's exactly how you would go about it. President Trump did not merely incite the insurrection, the Colorado majority wrote. Even when the siege of the Capitol was fully underway, he continued to support it. These actions constituted overt, voluntary, and direct participation in the insurrection. Maybe that's true. My recollection is that at the time it wasn't obvious that that was what was happening, although what was happening was clearly disgraceful. My recollection is also that Trump told the crowd before they left that they should peacefully protest. People on the left focused on the fact that he said you have to fight like hell, which is the sort of vague thing said by politicians all the time without meaning it to be taken literally. People on the right, some of whom condemned Trump heartily for how he behaved on various grounds, nevertheless note that he said to protest peacefully. What all of that tells you is that there is enough of a contested case on all of that you need to have proper process, even if what you think happened is the correct version. Trump and his supporters should have the right to defend themselves against the charges. And this isn't some right-wing Trump-loving take. The dissenting Democrat-appointed judges in Colorado made the same points in their dissenting statements. Chief Justice Boatwright noted that the challenge to Trump had been brought, quote, without a determination from a proceeding, e.g. a prosecution for an insurrection-related offence, with more rigorous procedures to ensure adequate due process. And Justice Samura agreed, our government cannot deprive someone of the right to hold public office without due process of law. Even if we are convinced that a candidate committed horrible acts in the past, dare I say, engaged in insurrection, there must be procedural due process before we can declare that individual disqualified from holding public office. Procedural due process is one of the aspects of America's democracy that sets this country apart. Well, not anymore, it seems. And now you have arguably the worst of all worlds. You have a moment where Trump is polling higher than Biden, making him the front runner to be the next president. And that is the moment that Democrat-appointed judges try to remove him from the ballot with no due process. Whereas Trump was, frankly, off his head with claims of having the election stolen in 2020, it'd be very hard to similarly dispute that case if the attempt was to be made successful for 2024. Right now, the Democrats are taking every opportunity they can to use Trump in the same sentence or in the same picture as Adolf Hitler, which is the rather familiar campaign strategy we've seen before that failed in the past, but because everyone is rubbish at politics these days, they just try the same stuff over and over. But to do so, while trying to have unelected judges remove your opponent from an election, who looks like the actual dictator in that scenario? And while Democrat politicians are largely trying to keep some distance between themselves and the decision, saying it's a matter for the courts, they are nevertheless, many of them anyway, accepting the lack of due process behind the premise. So Joe Biden said this week there was no question that Trump was responsible for leading an insurrection. It's self-evident, he said. No question about it. None. Zero. Well, he's entitled to his opinion, but again, it's not his power, nor anyone else's, just to have an opinion and then to legislate on it. Other Democrats shared the opinion. Biden's former chief of staff, Ted Kaufman, said, quote, I think they're right in what they're doing. That's what the Constitution says. It says it's an insurrection. Clearly what they did was an insurrection. Except, well, no, the Constitution doesn't define the term, nor a number of other rather important ones related to the case. Ironically, one of the other celebrators was from a group called Protect Democracy. Maybe they should change their name. Ian Bassin, their executive director, said that at a minimum, the decision meant that heading into the election, a state Supreme Court has found that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. Except they didn't. They took it as read. A finding would have implied a deliberative process looking at that question involving evidence, not simply the stating of their pre-held opinion as a prerequisite for deciding a different legal matter. If the opinion is right, all the more reason why there should be due process. So the country could then see that the judgment was fairly considered and arrived at, although it might be too late for that by now. So as I said, this will now end up at the US Supreme Court. 3 possible outcomes, 2 of them at least horrible for America. One is that the court overthrows the decision along party lines, so a 6-3 decision, 6 conservatives versus the 3 liberals. This makes half the country believe that Trump must have been legally guilty, because Colorado said so, the liberal Supreme Court justices agreed, and they want to believe it, so they do. But then a partisan decision from the Conservatives let him off. Hence they will conclude if he wins in 2024, he will not be a legitimate president. Indeed, an insurrectionist will have taken the White House. Another is that the court upholds the decision. The Conservatives decide to focus on the question of whether the amendment applies to the presidency and rule that it does, without stepping in on the main issue. I presume that outcome to be extremely unlikely, although there are some saying that mainstream conservatives might well be tempted to take the opportunity to take Trump out in a single final blow. I would be surprised if Supreme Court judges would think that a price worth paying, even if that is what they wish would happen, and I'm not aware of any evidence to suggest that they actually do. But if they did, you would then have the other half of the country clear that whoever wins the presidency is not the legitimate president because they only got there because the leading candidate at the time that it happened was unfairly pushed off the ballot. Again, if you think Trump should be bumped from the ballot, fair and square, cool. But it wouldn't have been fair and square. You defeat yourself by embracing a bad process to achieve what you believe to be a good end. And look, not least because it's then inevitable that the same thing will be used against you at the first opportunity. And where does that take you? The only way America dodges this bullet, I think, is if the left-leaning judges on the Supreme Court line up with the dissenting judges in Colorado, recognizing the horrible precedent this would set for the future, and join the Conservatives with a unanimous decision to toss it out, or maybe 8-1. Then it would be clear, not partisan. Basic principle, judges don't decide who gets to become president, voters do. And if there are criminal accusations, then at the very least a trial by a jury of their peers gets to decide on those after a full trial. As Democrat campaign supremo David Axelrod said, you don't want to tell the American people, I don't trust you to make the decision. And Democratic presidential candidate Dean Phillips agreed. He said that he personally absolutely believed that Trump was guilty of inspiring an insurrection. But he said this, do I believe it's wrong to ban him from the ballot in Colorado without a conviction? Absolutely. Heck, even the left-wing Guardian newspaper ran an editorial saying the same thing. And yet that basic principle is beyond Biden to repeat, it seems, which is unfortunate. If this all goes horribly wrong, it might well be that history decides both candidates failed American democracy when they had the opportunity to stand up for it. I mean, that all depends on who gets to write the history, I suppose. As we know, that can be an important variable. Bear in mind, I have said all of this, having gone on the record saying that a Trump-Biden rematch in 2024 is disastrous for the United States. I am no fan of either. It is the most likely matchup to result in horrible consequences. But you start to build those consequences step by step in the run-up to the election. It doesn't all just happen on one day. And that's exactly what both sides are doing here. But right now it's the Democrats making basic errors that nobody requires them to make. Trump has his back to the wall. It's fight or die. Now that's a problem of his own making, you might say. And sure, but the Democrats are making unforced errors all over the place. Their best strategy right now would be put the focus on Trump being Trump, but mostly talk about the good that they would do for the country in a second term. Run a good campaign, in other words, that connects with people on the issues that they care about and not the crazy stuff that their base is obsessed with, and draw a contrast between them and the raging turmoil on the other side. Yeah, that's how you'd think, but instead they're taking every single action that boosts Trump in the polls, so even people who think he's a barely coherent, monstrously egotistical idiot, they still end up supporting him because he's faced by an astonishing legal barrage attempting to bring him down without due process. I mean, in terms of political campaigning, you could not come up with a more incompetent strategy if you tried. When I first started talking about the growing likelihood of American civil war, or at least civil conflict, a number of people suggested I was being way too dramatic. America has always had sharply polarised political debates, they said. A lot more of those mainstream commentators are now looking at this and saying this is an absolutely pivotal moment and it threatens to ignite a powder keg. All I'm saying is that just once I would like to be able to do one of these videos where I can faithfully report that America decided today to step further away from rather than further towards an internal civil conflict. Well, not this week. When you do all your thinking about the new year and what 2024 will bring, maybe then think about how to reverse course. Make it a New Year's resolution. Although actually maybe don't, because we all know those only last until February at the latest. Either way, my thanks as always to the Patreons who support this channel. Without them, I would not be able to take the time to make these videos. If you would like to join them, head over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, this is the last video before Christmas arrives, so have a good one. See you soon.